Wildfires are a natural part of many ecosystems. However, in recent decades, they've become more frequent and severe. We spoke with Dr. Rachael Nolan from Western Sydney University in Australia to explore the effects of wildfires on native vegetation and discuss strategies for better management. Rachael is a leading expert in fire ecology and has closely studied and documented the impact of the Black Summer bushfires of 2019-2020 on Australia's native vegetation. Rachael, could you explain the effect fires have on native vegetation?
It's actually quite complex to explain, and it really depends on the vegetation that you're talking about. So fire has been around ever since the emergence of the first land plants. And so most vegetation is adapted to fire, but they're adapted to a specific fire regime. And so what I mean is the fire regime is composed of how frequent the fire is, so how many years between fires, the severity of the fire, so you might have an understory fire or an overstory fire, the season that the fire burns in, and also the extent of the fire. So plants and animals are adapted to this fire regime that's really unique to the particular location. And so it's when you get fire that's outside of that sort of natural regime they're adapted to that you can start to get negative impacts. So for some vegetation, like here, we might be looking at a fire regime of maybe every 20 years and the vegetation can handle that. But then at the extreme end, you've got rainforests that maybe are only adapted to one fire every 500 years. So the impact of fires, it really depends on if you get changes to fire regime, and there's all sorts of adaptations that plants and animals have to fire.
I think along those lines, fire is often seen as harmful to the environment. But is it always the case, or is there a bit more complexity to it?
I think we think of fire as harmful because it's often harmful for us humans. So where we build our houses and where we live, it's harmful to us. But one of the things that first got me excited about working in fire ecology was realising that fire isn't necessarily harmful for the vegetation. And in many cases, the vegetation needs fire. So a really good example is eucalypt forests, which we have so much of here in Australia. For many of our eucalypts, if you don't get a fire, they can't sustain themselves. So they need fire to stimulate seed germination and recruitment, and they're really well adapted to it. So rather than being damaging, it's actually something that's vital, and that many species have sort of built into their sort of evolutionary history that they're adapted to these fires and even need fires. I think where it's harmful is when you go outside of that fire regime. So when you start getting more frequent fire, which we're starting to see with climate change, or for some species, if you get fire occurring in different seasons, that might affect their capacity to flower after fire. So it's really dependent on the environment that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So regions like Australia, California, Brazil, they experience more intense and more severe fires, and more often also. So what factors are driving the intensification of fires in these regions?
So I think there's probably two main things going on. So with Australia, the big signal that we're seeing is an increase in forest fires. And that's primarily driven by climate change. So if you think about what you need for a fire, you need 4 ingredients. You need enough biomass to burn, and you can see in most environments, most forests, or woodlands, there's enough fuel available to burn, but it won't burn unless it's dry enough. So you need a drought conditions often is when you'll get the big forest fires. So you need an ignition source, so that most often comes from lightning, but sometimes it can come from human factors. For example, power lines spark fires quite a bit. And then you also need the right weather conditions, so we call that fire weather. So the really hot, dry, windy conditions will really push fire along. And so what climate change is doing is we're seeing an increase in the frequency of drought conditions, and also the droughts are becoming hotter. So just for that reason alone, you're likely to have the fuels drying out more, and that's driving the big fire seasons that we're seeing, and it's what was in large part responsible for the Black Summer fires. And then the second factor I'm just conscious that this isn't so much of my area of research, but I think it's really important to talk about, is changes in land management. And in Australia in particular, that was the cessation of Indigenous land management. So we had Indigenous people here managing the land in many different ways. One of the things they did was cultural burning, and cultural burning was done for a variety of different purposes. But it wasn't just cultural burning. They managed the land in all sorts of different ways that affected how flammable the environment was. And I think we're still getting a handle on what the sort of cultural burning regime was and how it differed in different places and how that might have affected the vegetation. And it is a little bit more challenging to try and understand that. So yeah, it's in Australia, it's really two things: climate change and changes to land management. In other parts of the world, it's different factors. Certainly climate change has been implicated in fires in North America in particular, but also even there, changes in land management and how they manage fire over the last couple of centuries.
When you come back to Australia, and especially after the arrival of British colonists here in Australia, the fire regimes changed dramatically. Yeah? Basically stopping the indigenous burning practices you mentioned earlier. So where are the differences, and do you think we could go back in the future to indigenous burning practices here in Australia?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's something that is really quite topical at the moment, particularly after the Black Summer fires. There's been a lot of interest in thinking about, well, how do we deal with the problem of fires, particularly as the climate changes? And one of the things that a lot of people are thinking really hard about is looking at cultural burning. I guess I want to make clear that cultural burning is done for cultural purposes, and often there's a really nice side effect that it reduces fuel loads, and that's good for us. It reduces fire risk, but it's not, the primary purpose isn't to reduce fuel loads and to reduce bushfires. It's a bit more complex than that, and I think we're only really, as a broader community, really starting to engage with this idea of how do we get Indigenous land management back on country. And I think there's many challenges to that. You know, we have had quite a long period of colonisation, and that's had many impacts. And so there's many challenges to reintroducing Indigenous land management. Yeah, like I said, it's not my area of research, so I don't want to sort of talk too much out of that. But I think it's not going to be the silver bullet solution, because there's so many challenges, but also the climate is changing. So I think it's definitely something that I really support. And so in my role as I'm director of the New South Wales Bushfire and Natural Hazards Research Centre. And so in my role as director of that, one of the things I've been really keen to try and foster is Indigenous engagement, and trying to do Indigenous engagement properly. And so we are looking at partnering with Indigenous community groups and really engaging them in a deep way, not in a superficial way. The first thing that we have to do is try and build relationships and build trust before we can then start to think about, well, what are the solutions that they would like to see? You know, how can we work with them rather than going in with, I guess, a pre-existing mindset. So I guess it's something I'm very passionate about, but it's just really early stages for me as a researcher, but also I think for Australians more generally to engage with this in a meaningful way.
So there's certainly a lot of scope for future research in this area. So Rachel, how would you envisage Australia's ecosystems, or especially the fire-affected ecosystems, in 50 to 100 years from now on? How will they look like?
It's a really, really hard question to answer. I think going back to what I was saying before about the different ingredients you need for a bushfire, you need the fuel to burn. And so I think for some of our ecosystems that are getting burnt too frequently, they will eventually transition to a different vegetation type. And so probably we won't get frequent fire because there'll be less stuff to burn. But that's sort of a long time in the future. I think intermediate steps, and what I think we're already starting to see, is changes in the structure of vegetation. So I guess thinking about examples in some of the wetter forests, So like the Mountain Ash Forest in Victoria, which typically has a fire return interval of maybe 200 years or 500 years. There's been a few areas where they've burnt 2 or even 3 times in 10, 20 years. And so those areas are being burnt too frequent for that forest to regenerate. And so what you're seeing is the mature trees are dying and they're being replaced with what's already there. And what's already there is the shrubs. And so that'll be an intermediate stage. Those shrubs are becoming dominant. Can other tree species come in? Certainly the climate would still be suitable and the environment would still be suitable and the fire regime would still be suitable for trees. But how do those trees get there? Is it something that we need to actively manage? And that's another question that I think is really at the forefront of thinking about fire management at the moment. Do we actively manage these places or we just wait and see what happens? This is a bit of a tangent, but after the Black Summer fires, there was a really big concerted effort by the Victorian government to reseed a lot of those forests. So it was recognised that they'd burnt more frequently than they could handle. And so they did aerial drops of seeds to try and regenerate that forest back to the species that they were. But that's not feasible at large scale for a lot of ecosystems. And so I think there'll be, I guess getting back to your question, there'll be structural changes. So we might see less trees and less of the big old trees. There's some research done recently. I was working with my postdoc Eli Bendel. He's done a lot of research on how the forests are recovering after the Black Summer fires. And what he's finding is that for many of the forests, the good news is they're just fine. Like a lot of our eucalypts are really resilient, and even after really severe widespread fires and severe drought, they're recovering in the way we expect them to. But he's also finding that some of the wetter forest types are where we're seeing death of the big old trees. Often that's because the big old trees, they've been damaged in previous fires, and so they're just not structurally as stable. So we're seeing those big old trees die, and those trees are the ones that store the most amount of carbon. They're also the most important for biodiversity. They often have the tree hollows, which support the habitat for wildlife. And so it's still the same species, but you're missing the big trees. So I think in sort of the immediate to sort of short term, we're going to see changes in structure, some shifts in species, but over the longer term, we'll see shifts in species. And I don't know how that's going to play out, because I think it depends on how much we want to actively manage these places and how much we just see what happens. And I think it was quite upsetting for a lot of fire ecologists and a lot of ecologists in general during Black Summer fires, thinking, well, is this a sign of things to come? And so I want to be conscious of not being too sort of negative. I think there's plenty of ecosystems that'll be fine, but there's some that I think we're going to lose them.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your insights today on the fire ecology of Australia.
Yeah, thanks.